Hi, so in this video I'm going to be explaining my lightsaber and how I created it. I've had a lot of people ask me how I can set it in world space and leave it there, as well as how the collisions work on it with the particles and sounds actually traveling up and down the lightsaber, as well as just a couple other things about it. So I wanted to make a video that kind of explains just the essentials for how this works. Uh, I don't know how long this video is going to be, so what I'm going to do is create a detailed timeline for it in the description so you can go to the different spots that you might be more interested in. Um, but to give you a general overview, is we're going to be talking about briefly about the network syncing. I made another video on network syncing variables that will also help if you need to know exactly how to network sync, but I'll kind of explain the logic behind some of the network syncing. I'll be talking about the on-off animations for toggling the lightsaber and the beam on and off, the grabbing motion, so pulling it off of the hip and then setting it in the world space and being able to pick it back up. Then I'll be covering the effects, so the motion going up and down the lightsaber with the particles and the sounds. And then I'll cover the actual collision layer itself that's driving the particles and the sounds for the animations. And then I'll just kind of demonstrate the lightsaber to you guys again, which I also have a video that's just showing the lightsaber in action. A little bit of a funny video, but fun nonetheless to kind of showcase what the lightsaber can do. So if we hop into it really quick, we have our network synced variables. And again, this video will kind of assume that you have a general basic understanding of contacts and how to navigate through Unity. And use Unity. If I made this like very step by step on everything, this video would be hours long. So I'm going to be kind of giving this tutorial with the basis that you have a general understanding of how to navigate through Unity and create animations and things, because I won't be covering those as in depth. Just kind of the ideas behind these things, and I'll show you the animations themselves in the animation tab just to kind of see what I did. But here we just have a normal network synced variable. Again, I have another video that explains this if you don't understand what this is. I encourage you just to go watch that. It'll explain the importance of doing this as well. Then we also have the Saber grabbed and holstered layer, which this is again a network synced variable, but it interacts a little bit differently because of the way that the motion for picking up our lightsaber and dropping it works, which I'll explain a little bit more later. But just know that we have a variable for it being grabbed and a variable for it being holstered, and then this triggering when both of them are happening at the same time, which is important again for our motion, which I will show you later on. So our receivers that are network synced, which I'm going to close these, I have different ones set up for testing purposes. So if you can ignore this first one, this is what you use in game. And I just have it interacting with all these different layers here, these different tags. But for the sake of this video of testing things, I just have a testing receiver setup. But it is locally driven and it's only allowing others to interact with it. And we're using a constant for this. It's using Saber collision as my parameter that I'm driving. And so you can see here, I've got Saber grabbed, holstered, proximity, and collision as my floats. And then I have grabbed net, holstered net, and collision net, but not proximity net. What we're going to want is we're going to want our grabbing to be networked so that it essentially cannot get desynced from people. And if it does, it'll update when you interact with it. And so that's why we have grabbed and holstered networked. And then we also have our actual collision hits being networked as well. So the collision's always going to happen for someone. And then the reason that we're leaving our proximity, so our proximity receiver here is the receiver that actually drives our collisions up and down the lightsaber itself. We are not network syncing this because we want other people to actually see this where they're seeing it, not where I'm seeing it. Otherwise, it'll be delayed and desynced for them. And so I have this set up to where it's just the proximity itself, because it isn't important if this is network synced. This is only for people actually present to see this. So we don't need to network sync this. So this is, again, just briefly our network syncing. I'll explain this a little bit more later as we get into the actual motion for the lightsaber. These aren't actual any animations either. They're just empty clips that are just, they have parameter drivers on them. They just use parameter drivers. Again, network synced video explains the idea behind this and why this is important. So now we're going to hop into the layer that's just our toggling on and off our lightsaber, as well as our effects. So this right here is just toggling the lightsaber off and on. So our animations here are just going to be setting our game object on and off. And it has a few other things here for what I'm doing. This can vary depending on what you're doing. If you're using this for like a normal sword that doesn't have a beam coming out of it, then you probably won't need like the retraction sound being turned off, because you don't have a sound for, you know, your sword blade, because it's already out. I just have these things being toggled off to make sure that nothing slips through of like accidentally playing when I swap between these animations. But the gist of your animation here will be, you have an animation that's toggling your game objects off for your lightsaber, so maybe, or sword, whatever it might be. So maybe you have your beam being turned off and the game object itself being turned off. Let me see here. I can go into lightsaber off here. So you can see I have all of these objects turned off, which is like my point light that I have here for it, because it has a light source on it, and then the two particle systems for the beam itself, as well as then I have the receivers being turned off, and the collision sounds, and the sparks being turned off, and these other sounds being turned off, because I don't want any of these things to play on accident whenever this animation plays or it comes back to this animation. So we're covering our bases by making sure everything's turned off, and this animation here will be turning everything on. And again, your mileage is going to kind of vary depending on what exactly you're building here. If you're building a sword, then these layers here are probably going to be useless for you, because these are just for the beam itself, for the lightsaber beam coming out, and then this is an effect to turn it off and return it back into the default state of the lightsaber mesh being on, but the particles being off. And so I can show you this here really quick. And I'm going to mute the audio just because the lightsaber is very loud. So you see how the lightsaber is on right now. Not the effects though, just the lightsaber itself. If I turn this off, it goes back over here and the lightsaber is off. Turn this back on and it turns the lightsaber on. And now if I do gesture right equals 1, because I use my right hand to grab the lightsaber, and then my right hand would have to be over the lightsaber for this to happen. But since I'm using a network synced variable, I can just toggle this on and replicate that my hand's over it. It puts this inside in my hand, essentially here. And so what I can do is, now that this is in my hand, I can do gesture right equals 3, which is to toggle on my lightsaber effects. So you can see the beam comes out now. And we move into lightsaber effects. And now I can do whatever gestures that I want, and it's not going to toggle off until I do gesture right equals 7, which is to toggle off my beam. And it toggles it off here really quick, and then it goes back into lightsaber, and it just sits here. And if I do gesture right equals 2, this will actually leave the lightsaber in the world. Again, I'll explain this in the motion layer, but this essentially allows me to leave the lightsaber wherever I want in the world. I can just drop it there and leave it. If I do gesture right equals 1, again, this is assuming that my collider on my hand is touching the receiver on my lightsaber. And I can do gesture right equals 1, and it's going to actually grab the lightsaber again. And so going back to my layer here, that needs both of these to be true for it to actually drop it onto my hip. So grabbed and holstered has been set as true. And so if I do 2 here, it'll actually drop it onto my hip. And so let me show you the senders and receivers here that I have interacting with this. So if we go in and we turn on our saber body, we have senders and receivers here. So this receiver right here is the contact receiver that's actually driving the animations in our collision layer. So this will actually be telling them to turn on and off. And then I have a sender here that just interacts with other weapons and such. You can kind of set this up how you need it, but this interacts with other weapons to tell it, hey, this is a lightsaber that can interact with these weapons. It'll trigger things to occur with these objects if they have animations set up to interact with this. And then for our proximity receiver, we have this large circle that is placed at pretty much the center of the lightsaber beam where it starts off. And it goes to the edge of the beam. And Yash essentially explained, and this is the same thing in Yash's automaton, that this gives you the distance away from the beginning of the beam here, and then the actual turning on of the effects that collides with the beam occurs from making contact with this receiver here, which they're a little misaligned, and the reason I do that is so that people's colliders aren't directly on the edge of their player. They're a little deeper, so I have it offset a little bit so you can still see it on the edge of their player. But essentially what happens here is that a object can enter from anywhere in this proximity receiver, but it's only going to actually play the animations when it then makes the collision with this object here, with this receiver here. And so we use this proximity receiver to drive our animation up and down the beam here, and then this receiver here to actually play that. And so then we also have our receivers on our blade here, or on our hilt here. So if I can find, there we go. So we have a sender and a receiver on the actual lightsaber itself. And so our reason for this, let me zoom in here. So our reason for this is so that I can drop the lightsaber either in the world or on my hip. And so what happens is that this sender here has to be making contact with a receiver that's on my hip right here. And what happens is whenever this is on my hip and it is setting Saber hip to 1, it will essentially tell me that Saber grabbed and Saber holstered is set to 1. And so what that does is that allows me to then say, okay, well, since these two things are true and gesture right equals 2, then it's going to play it here onto my hip. And the other condition I have here is that if I just toggle off the lightsaber, it's just going to snap it back to my hip because it's toggled off and it's going to reset it. This is the animation we care about here. So again, we've taken our floats and we've converted them into network synced variables. And so just think of these as our floats. And these are 1. So true is the same as it equaling 1. True is the same as equaling 1 here. And then false is the same as equaling 0. So if our saber grabbed, because it's going to be in our hand, so it's going to stay with saber grabbed as 1, right? Because it's in our hand. So if this is true, and then saber holstered, which is our receiver that's on our hip, is also true. So that way it knows that it's on our hip. And then we do gesture right equals 2, which is open hand. It'll release it onto our hip. So it'll snap this animation back to our parent constraint that's on our hip. And so if we do that, then say that saber grabbed is true, but saber holstered is not. Well, then we're going to tell it to go to the world. We're going to drop it in the world space instead. Because saber holstered isn't true, so we know it's not going to be going to our hip, which means that we can leave it in the world itself. Sorry if this is a little convoluted or hard to understand, but it's a very, very complex but not complex at the same time setup, where once you understand it, it's really simple and easy to do, and really fun to incorporate in a lot of things, but initially it can be kind of daunting to understand. So it's important to kind of understand these transitions themselves. And so what I can show is I can show these animations themselves for each of these motions. So we'll start with our saber holstered, so you can kind of see what's happening here. So we have our evil saber here with bones. And let me just click on this again. Okay, so we have a parent constraint on our evil saber here. With 2 different weights. And I'll go back over here. What happens is whenever we are toggling this to be on our hip, we're changing in our animation for the hip lightsaber lock to be 1, and for our right wrist saber lock to be 0, because we don't want it to snap to our wrist, we want it to snap to our hip. And we also toggle on the parent constraint here. And the reason that we're doing that is because of our world constraint, which I'll explain here in a second. But if we're going to saber held, then we're just going to reverse this. We're going to toggle on the parent constraint, and we'll set our saber hip to 0 and our right wrist to 1, because we want it to go to the parent constraint on our wrist, right? On our wrist here. Okay, so going back to this. So for the world constraint, which is the fun part of it, is that our animation to essentially drop our object in the world is setting both of these to 0 and toggling off the parent constraint. Because what happens here is that our object is inside of a container, and this container is constrained to a world transform. And all this world transform is if you make an object here, just create a game object and 0 it out. Okay, you zeroed it out and you just drag this out. You've created the same thing as this world transform. It's the exact same thing. And so what you do is for this world transform is you just grab your prefab here in your project folder and you just drag it in here. And that's it. That's the entire world constraint. Let's see. Delete this really quick. So that's what that is. That is our world constraint, to where we constrain the actual object to sit freely in the world itself. And so what happens is that whenever you're doing your saber or your sword being dropped in the world, is you're setting again both of these weights to 0, because you don't want it to be constrained to either one of these objects. And you then also are wanting this parent constraint to be turned off. Because what will happen is this will then override it, and it'll say, okay, we're going to be using this parent constraint for our location. And this parent constraint is constrained to the center of the world, just wherever you dropped it from your avatar. And so that's how these work here. And then again, you've got your logic in between them, where if your saber grabbed is true, and your gesture right equals 1, which is fist, and then your lightsaber is also on, then you can grab your lightsaber and it transitions to held. And so it goes to our right hand lock. And then say you're wanting to drop it in the world. Well, okay, as long as saber grabbed is false and gesture right equals 2 and saber holstered is false, then it's going to drop it in the world. And it's actually for true or false here. I found kind of a weird issue where sometimes saber grabbed will be 0 even though you're holding it when interacting with the holstered receiver here. So you just want to make sure that you cover your saber grabbed or your grabbed networked variable as being both true and false, but the other two here will be the same. So your gesture right equals 2, and then your holstered is equaling false. So you just want to make sure those are for your saber world. And again, back to saber holstered. Our saber grabbed is true. Our saber holstered is true. So it knows that it's in this area. And then gesture right equals 2 to actually do the animation itself. And so that's kind of our logic for the motion of the lightsaber and placing it in the world. It's a little complex. Honestly, an entirely separate video could be made on creating something like this. But I wanted to give you guys an idea of how this works. And if you have questions or want me to make a full-blown video explaining parent constraint motion like this, I can do that. It's a little bit more in-depth than this, but this is kind of your general gist of how I do the motion. And if you want to, you can make this a lot simpler and not have it do the world constraint. So you can just have it go between holstered and held if you really want to, and you get rid of the need for this entirely. So that is our motion here. What we want to go to next here is the effects motion, which this is a lot simpler. It's a lot simpler than the other motion. So what this animation is being driven by our Saber proximity float. So we're using our proximity float here. So this float that is driven right here from the location of an object entering it, we use that to actually drive the motion time for our animation here. And so if we look at this animation, all this animation is, actually let me go into here and we have effects motion, which this actually probably won't work just because I have this set up differently. It might though. Okay, yeah. So what I did is I just recorded the collisions and sounds game object being moved up and down the actual beam of the lightsaber. And what happens is, since this animation is being driven by the proximity float, that means that it will scrub across this animation by using the float itself. So the float is actually telling it where it is on this timeline in this animation. And so what I did is I just had it start from the outside here and go in based on 0 to 1 for the proximity of the for the proximity receiver. And so this right here is actually driving our game object up and down our beam here based on the location of where someone is in the proximity receiver. This layer is super simple. It is, again, and I don't think I mentioned this at the start, but I don't use write defaults. So this is with write defaults off. This is driving our proximity just up and down the actual beam itself. So going into our collision effects layer, this is a little, it's a little more complex, just based on the things that I was wanting to do with this by allowing the ability to have a constant collision. The impacts itself are actually relatively simple. It can seem kind of daunting at first, but I promise you this isn't as bad as it seems. It's just a lot of the same thing happening over and over, which is why that looks like there's a ton of transitions. Essentially what we have is just an animation here that has all of our effects off. So it turns all of our audio sources off here, just toggles these off, all of them, and it toggles off our particle systems. Now you can do this two ways. The reason that I have, well, you can do the particles two ways. You can't really do the sounds two ways. The reason I have 3 sounds for the normal impacts is so that I can have multiple audio sources playing on top of each other. Otherwise, if you collided with the lightsaber and it made the sound, but then it was immediately collided with afterwards, it would cut the sound off and play it again, which doesn't sound very good. So what I did and a friend recommended to me is, hey, why don't you create 3 audio sources? They're exactly the same. And what happens is that one of these gets played, and then if a collision happens again immediately afterwards, it transitions to this next animation that then turns on our second sound source. And then say another happens. Okay, well, our third sound source is toggled on. Our second sound source is left on because it was already toggled on. And our first sound source is toggled off. So you can see that over here. And these are really like simply named. So we have impact 1, so our first sound plays. Impact 2, our second sound plays. Impact 3, our third sound plays. Our second sound is left on because it might still be making its sound. And then hopefully our first sound's done by now. And so this one's getting toggled off. So that then whenever another impact happens, we go and okay, we're turning back on 1. So we're turning this sound back on. We're turning this one off, sound 2, because hopefully this one's done playing by now. And sound 3 is left on. Okay, then we transition out of that into just a buffer state and then back into this one. And so what this one does is this leaves on our sound 1, turns on our sound 2 because this just got toggled off, and then turns off our sound 3, which is hopefully done playing by now. And this essentially just cycles between them. So our Saber collision net, and I have this buffer to catch this here because I had some issues where when you would turn on the animation, it would actually briefly turn on the sound or blip the floats to 1. And so this just captures those floats really quick. So essentially whenever you turn on the blade, collision net equals true and gesture right equals 3 just for my turning on of the blade. And so it gets caught in here, which just does nothing. And then it immediately cycles out with collision net being false. And then we can run into our, okay, Saber collision net equals true and gesture right is not equal to 3. That allows us to play our first sound. And so then Saber collision net is false, and it just goes into a buffer. And then it equals true again. So Saber collision net is true. Then it goes back into our impact sound, and then false, back out, true, back in. So it just repeats back and forth. It seems really complex, but it's really not. It's just falses and trues going back and forth here. One other thing that I have set up is that, say we're stuck in one of these transition states, so we've hit people a few times, and now we're stuck inside of this transition state, and then we toggle off the blade. Well, then I just have this to where, since our toggling off, actually I need to change this to 7, not 3. But whenever gesture right ideally equals 7, not 3, then what will happen is it will just run to this animation that then immediately toggles off our impact. The trickier part is that these impacts are a little bit longer in terms of their clip length, and I'll show you what I mean. So we have Saber collision 1. So we have these as about half a second is about how long they are. Just a little over half a second long. 1 being a second here, 30 being half a second. That's for the sound to entirely play. And another reason for that is so that we have a transition duration out of our impact. So what happens is that we have a transition coming out of our impacts, and this is true for every single impact here between all of these different animations that play our collisions, is that if Saber collision equals true and it plays for the entire impact duration, that means that our lightsaber is staying in someone, and it stayed in someone long enough that it's going to then trigger our animation that actually plays our constant zapping sound, as well as our constant particles coming out. And so it'll sit in this animation until Saber collision net is false. And so what I want to do is just kind of demonstrate this for you guys so you can kind of see what's happening here. I will turn on the sound again. Bear with, it's a little loud. I can move this a little further away so it won't be as loud. Okay. So we have our lightsaber toggled on. We do gesture right equals 1. And then our grabbed net has to be toggled on as well. Cool. So now we've got our lightsaber. We do gesture right equals 3. Our lightsaber is now on. I think our sound's still off. Oh no, we're just too far away. Okay. I went a little bit too far. There we go. That's good, that's good. Okay. So now what we do is we'll do our Saber collision net. So this will basically be replicating if a cinder interacts with this, right? So the cinder isn't going to actually interact with our blade, but this will be replicating it. So what happens here is we click this, and it plays our sound really quick. So we have different sounds here that we can cycle between. And so you see, we toggle this on and off because we're replicating swinging through someone. So we toggle it on and off really quick, like we're hitting them. But if I toggle this on and replicate it as if it's being left inside of someone, so it's constantly colliding, it'll play this animation, and then it will go into our constant. So watch. It plays our animation, and then it goes into our constant. And this is then just this animation constantly playing. And it just cycles and does the same thing. Now, you can see here, our tester will actually be deriving the location of our game object. So you can see right here, our game object will be represented by the sound and particle icons. So what happens is, whenever we move this up and down, it's moving our proximity. You can see our proximity moving right here. Our proximity float. And that's driving our animation over here. Saber effects motion. So that's actually driving this animation's time, essentially. It's driving the location inside of it here. So we move up and down here, and it's going to move, it's scrubbing across this animation. And so that's that's like the culmination of everything we're using here, is you can see if I stop doing collision net, it'll go into this buffer and it'll hold for a few seconds, and then it'll hop back into our impact off. And what I did is that if it goes into this animation, and then it goes into this buffer, if it's immediately hit afterwards again, it'll quickly go back to the impact off, and then immediately go to the next impact. So if you watch here, or the buffer, play it again. So it skips through the buffer, and it goes immediately back into the impacts here. And you can see here, we're getting stuck inside of the transition buffer. And if we do, I think 3, yeah, it technically goes to off. That should be 7, which is just my fault here for improperly setting that up. But ideally, I have that set up to 7. So whenever I do 7 and it toggles off the blade, it also toggles off all the animations and stuff here for sounds, for impacts and things like that. And so you can see again, too, I have it set up so that if the saber is on my hip, I can't accidentally toggle on my blade. So you know how saber gesture right equals 3 toggles on the lightsaber effects. What I did in the layer over here for our lightsaber is that gesture right equals 3, and then saber grabbed net also has to be true. So it has to be in our hand for us to toggle this on. It's not going to work if it's setting in the world space or if it's setting on our hip. Only if it's in our hand can we toggle it on. And it'll also toggle off the beam if I set it back onto my hip. So that is the general overview of this here. Again, I know it can be confusing concepts. Just know that these are relatively simple and messing through them, and I really, really highly recommend going through to different parts of this video that you might have questions or misunderstandings, or if there's something I missed that I might have just forgotten. As you can see, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layer setup. I've probably missed something, and someone will have some crucial questions, and I've tried to cover everything that I can think of that are the necessities for how this works. I can really quickly, what I'll do is I'll show you the animations for the collision effects. So if we go to, let's look at one of these impacts. So this right here is our impact 3, and 2 being on, and our 1 being toggled off. So what happens is that our sparks game object is being toggled off, the first one, and our sound game object, or sound audio source component, is being toggled off as well. But then 2 and 3 are being toggled on. 2 was already on, 3 is being set on. So we're making sure that 2 stays on while also toggling on 3. And this happens with all of our game objects. And the reason I have a extra set here is for the quest side. I smashed my quest stuff into these same animations, so they'll work cross-platform. So all of these animations, whether it's impact 1 and 3 but not 2, or impact 1 and 2 but not 3, interact in the same way. You're just wanting to make sure that the last game object that you turned on, so like 1, will need to be turned off as you transition into 2 and 3. And so that's these animations here. And then again, going back into, I wanted to make sure that this was explained. We have our, now that we've looked at our motion, we have our different network synced floats here, which again, this might end up being useless as we get into hopefully having bools just be able to be used for our receivers and senders. But what I have here is that I just have my waiting animation that turns both of the network synced variables off. And then this is just setting my grabbed network synced variable to true. And this one sets my holstered to true. And as you saw earlier, we need both of them to be true to drop the lightsaber onto our hip. So I just have these all crammed into one layer here. You could do these in separate layers, but I have them just crammed into one layer because I had like 8 or 9 layers with this to begin with, and I condensed it down into this, which it could probably be condensed more, but it would involve some more annoying layer setup. So I've kind of left it with it being 6 layers at the moment, with these last 2 being hopefully useless in the future when we don't need to basically convert our floats into bools. But this is the general setup for our animations here and the logic. Again, your mileage is going to vary depending on what you're creating. If you're creating a sword, instead of, you know, a collision sound for a zapping lightsaber, you're going to have maybe like a metal clinging sound, and you can cycle through 3 different metal clinging sounds instead, if you want to do it that way. And the one thing that I did mention earlier is that I have 3 different game objects, actually 4 here, but 3 different game objects for the actual impacts themselves for the particles. And you can do this 2 different ways. You can either use buffer particles, which if you don't know what those are, I know there are a couple of videos out there that explain those, but for people that do know what these are, you can use buffer particles and just, you know, use one source here for buffer particles, or you can have 3 different particle systems. And you can just cycle through these 3 different particle systems, being toggled on and off based on which collision is happening. And then again, this constant sparks is the same as these other ones here, just a little bit more. It's got a little bit more sparking, I think, potentially. Yeah, because these are just bursts, whereas this is a constant emission. And so I have this set up just so that it constantly sparks, and every now and then it'll have a small little burst of sparks that'll come out on top of that. So you can set that up either with buffer particles or just cycling through a couple game objects. I don't think there's really much of performance hit here between using multiple game objects or one particle system. There might be a little bit if you want to use buffer particles, but you can do it this way as well. So I will really quick just show it again so you guys can kind of see what we're working with here. And if you have questions about how this works, or something I might have missed, because I definitely could have missed something, then just ask in the comments below. Again, I'm more than happy to explain what I'm doing here with the system. So particles here, and then we'll toss Saber here, and so you can see if I move this down here, as much as I could. Again, could probably do a little better with simplifying things, but this is about as simple as I could get it for the most part, without just like completely redoing the entire system itself. So again, if you guys have questions, just ask them in the comments below. More than happy to explain things. I'll be making a few other tutorials explaining other aspects of the lightsaber and other things that I'm working on if you guys need that. I know people are asking about the nut button, so I'll be kind of talking about that one as well and explaining the blend shape and how that works. And I also have had people ask about the ears being stretched and causing other animations to play, so I'll be making a tutorial on showing how those work and playing sounds and other things with that as well. So thank you guys for watching, and have a great day.